Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And today, again, we're speaking with Rev Dr Gordon Preece. He's the director of the Ethos Centre for Christianity and Society, and he's an Anglican minister. Gordon, we talked last week about calling. We talked last week about the fact that this whole power of the wounded healer has had quite an influence around you as a person. How has that launched your later career activities? What's the basis?
I think it's been that kind of having an ear for the outsider and wanting to kind of magnify their voices, listen to those voices, the people who don't normally get heard.
Yes.
And both in the church and in society. So I think I've spent a lot of time in terms of trying to empower Christians in their work.
Yes.
So that we don't have a kind of hierarchy between clergy and laity, but really recognise that the people on the front line are Christians who are serving humbly in all sorts of spheres of society, Monday to Friday, etc. So really enabling them to see themselves as ministers. It's not just the people who are up front on a Sunday, it's the people who are kind of taking the towel of service like Jesus and washing the feet of humanity. Yes. Carrying some of the, taking some of the crap of the world on themselves, that the people who need to be lauded and empowered and encouraged. Yes. And have the sense they're not doing it by themselves, that they're actually doing it as God's people, as they're scattered. They're not just isolated individuals, sort of like fingers cut off from the hand, but they have a sense of community in the way they do that. So that's been the case, particularly in terms of the workplace. And I did my doctorate on the area of calling or vocation and how people sort of discover that and develop that from God, how God kind of plants that in people and how it gets developed through God's Spirit giving them gifts and that, as well as sort of natural talents and how Jesus calls people. But I think in terms of mental illness, I've mentioned that, and we have an issue coming out of our Equip magazine on mental illness, and we've called it Stick the Stigma of Mental Illness. Yes. Using that old sort of, sort of stick it up them kind of old Australian phrase in a way. Yes. But that comes too from a sense of, the old picture of the stigmata, the sort of wounds of Jesus and people talking about that. Well, there's a sense in which Christ took that on himself. He was actually, even his own family at one point thought he was mad, or some thought he was demon possessed. Yes, that's right. So that he has taken that stigma on himself and taken it away finally on the cross. He's borne our wounds, whether physical wounds or mental wounds. Right. That he's done that. I think that applies to refugees, because with the group Love Makes a Way outside Bill Shorten's office Monday week back, and protesting outside there. There was a group inside, the ones who were eventually arrested, not for anything violent. It was completely non-violent. We sent flowers in and card and that. But just somehow wanting them to try and recognise that, as Bill Shorten's a family man, Tony Abbott is too, that children in detention, these are people who belong in families, and that they don't belong behind bars, and they're not criminals. They have a right as asylum seekers to seek asylum, and so to connect the personal and the political in that kind of way, I think is the way to try to get to people's hard. It's not just a purely intellectual kind of argument.
Right.
And I guess that's what we were trying to do there. For again, I think for a Christian, if I had time to make up a banner, it would have been Refugeesus. because Jesus was a refugee.
Yes,
he was
that's
carted off as a child to
Yes.
because of persecution, because King Herod was trying to have him killed. He
Yes.
went off to Egypt, just like God's people, the Jews, were. The term Hebrew or Hebrew actually comes from the term for refugee. Scattered group of people, almost like gypsies around the ancient Middle East and that. So, but I think the kinds of issues I've gotten involved in have basically those deep roots in the very nature of God in Christ,
Yes.
and in those sorts of areas, and how to empower those people, like empowering lay people, empowering people to be able to speak up and express their own perspective on their own situation in life. And so the writing I do, the publications that we publish through Ethos, etc., are designed to, they're largely from lay people, and people with real expertise in various areas in society and culture, like Mick Pope,
Yes.
the Pope, who's a meteorologist speaking on climate change, who you had just a week ago, I think.
Yes.
People like that.
Yeah, I come to something that I've read that you had said, like, I want the bread of life that never goes stale. How does that fit into because that's what I'm getting from you as I'm talking now. This is bread of life stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, like I think I think there are a lot of people who are searching. I think, but I think there's a lot of ignorance in the world these days. We've kind of lost some access to both our Christian heritage or other spiritual heritages, and so I think there are a lot of people actually being fed junk food.
Yes.
In many ways, and they're really they're just focused kind of on the present quite often, and what's the latest kind of fad or whatever, and the things that have stood the test of time, the hopes that enable us to deal with the hopes and fears of all the years,
Yes.
that have been that are tried and true. I think we're missing out on a lot of that.
Yes.
So for me, that's and that would particularly be focused on that phrase about the bread of life that never goes stale. It's not only an everlasting quantity of life, but it's the very quality of life that Christ had.
Yes.
And in a contagious kind of sense, and wanting to help people catch that. You're not going to be able to shove that down people's throats. It's
You won't shove stale bread down the throat either, which goes stale over time. We've got a break.
Yep.
We'll be back in a moment.
Mani Allah, Alleluia, Mani Allah.
Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And we're speaking with Rev Dr Gordon Preece. We had the situation of you mentioning a couple of times ethos. What's ethos?
Well, Ethos is a collaboration of a number of people, largely lay people. I think I'm the only ordained one amongst us, who have real kind of expertise in particular areas. So I'd mentioned Mick Pope. Denise Cooper-Clarke has a doctorate in that she did on the issue of euthanasia. Brian Edgar he used to run the predecessor to Ethos. He has a great deal of ethical and scientific kind of knowledge. There's a range of people who develop little think tanks. So Mick Pope heads up Ethos Environment. I head up Ethos Business, and we teach courses. So at the Macquarie University School of Applied Finance, we train finance professionals there. We do. We give ethical investment advice and training to the staff at Christian Super, which is a Christian superannuation fund that wins lots of awards as best ethics fund or ecological fund. It's certainly up there as one of the most ethical in Australia. And it's recently decided to scrap investing in coal
Oh, right.
coal producers,
Yes.
or people who get more than 20, corporations that get more than 20% of their income from coal.
Right.
So we're working on that now. So we're involved in a range of projects that are trying to help us look at not only the kind of how do you heal the woundedness of people and how do you address the ethical issues and the character issues, because ethos means character. So it's the questions of, well, what kind of world do we want to have? You know,
Yes.
do we want to just have a world where we're basically going to threaten the survival of creation?
Yes.
Do we want to have what kind of nation do we want to be? Do we want to be, one that actually, like the national anthem says, where we do actually welcome people from across the seas, or are we going to basically just going to, put up the gates and fob them off onto some of the poorest countries in the world? And what kind of church do we want to be? A church where there's been, dreadful scandals of abuse, for instance.
Yes.
How are we going to deal with those kinds of issues and clean up our own act? And what kind of families do we want to have? What character do we want to have as individuals or as professionals, etc. So a lot of what we do is trying to look at, well, what's the story that we need to shape us and find our character in. If you don't, my son's been an actor, and I used to get his scripts and faxed through in the days of faxes, and you can't have a character without having a narrative, without having a story. And I think one of the things people find difficult today, particularly probably a lot of younger people, I think, is that we've lost a sense of character, or some people use a big term like meta-narrative.
Yes.
Whether the things, whether it's Christianity or it could be, certain other religions, or it could be the narrative of progress, capitalism, socialism, etc.
Yes.
That there are lots of question marks over a lot of these different sorts of meta-narratives that are out there, or stories, and so people are finding it harder for all the choices they have to work out, well, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of work do I want to do? What kind of character do I want to have? It's quite hard, I think, these days.
Yes, that's correct. And I think there's the issue too with that narrative. There's a lot of what you spoke about has got political connotations to it. How do you bring that potential narrative to politicians? You're in the political arena when you start to discuss these issues.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier about, say, with going to visit Bill Shorten, the group that went there. I think you have to. I think we can often debase politicians, and we can, but they're only really reflective of us. We do live in a democracy after all.
That's right.
And so, rather than making scapegoats of them, I think we've got to try and connect with them. The two current leaders, the major parties, they both have families. How do you connect with them so that they can identify that, well, refugees are in those situations with families. They're risking their lives often to make a better future for their families. And so the whole personalist political thing, I think, is quite critical.
Yes.
And how do we turn around a kind of climate of fear and sort of fortress Australia to actually have a climate of openness? How can we have sort of a sense of hospitality between the different religions as well? Not just tolerance, where you just put up with people from other religions or other cultures, but a sense of openness and welcome, and turn from hostility to hospitality.
Yes.
Towards those people. I think there's some of the big challenges that we face, and that's the kind of thing we try to do with Ethos. We're only willing to cooperate with people on those issues.
That's great, because just getting back to politics, as they say, you get the politicians that you deserve because we voted. So that implies that the narrative for the voters needs to change. So what do you do? How do you get that exposed? As you got your magazine, what else would you do? Yeah,
well, I think you've got to ask who's telling the stories in the end, and we live in a culture where there's massive sort of monopoly in the press and in our media. And that is a big danger, I think, for us as a country.
Absolutely.
That's why it's important to have community television, community radio, social media, to get other voices out there. Even if they're often small and struggling, and often there's a lot of voluntary work involved in them. That's what it's like for Ethos and that. But we do. We are the publisher of the Australasia's best religious publication for 2013, Zadok Perspectives, and we try with that. These days in print, you've got to have something that actually has beauty about it.
Yes,
I think if you're going to put something out there, it's got to have something extra that appeals to the aesthetic side. It's not just purely cognitive. Not like, well, we have plenty of sort of mind food. It's not junk food.
No, but there's something else. There's a hook.
Yeah.
And the hook is time, and we're just out of it for the moment. We'll be back. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Rev Dr Gordon Preece. Gordon, we were discussing media and how you get out there before the break. You mentioned a thing called AMAP. What's that?
AMAP is the Australian Media Engagement Project, and it's one of our partners at Ethos, and they're working with journalists and others. They have some eminent sort of journalists, or in some cases recently retired, like say Barney Zorts, who's religion editor of The Age, Jonathan Holmes of Media Watch fame. He's going to do some interviews on an event that they're going to hold in Sydney soon, and trying to help journalists uphold the journalist code, if you like, the code of ethics, but also to try and not only look at codes but also modes. This is sort of like the character side of things.
Yes.
How do you make wise judgments? How do you stick up for truth? How do you have a sense of professional identity as a journalist that is broader than just your loyalty to the person who pays you, the organisation that pays you? And so there's some of the issues that that we're exploring through that AMAP's exploring, and we're kind of partnering with them in that. So that's one of the projects that we have. We partner with lots of people. When you're small, you need to basically sort of combine with other groups that are small, and it's a bit like the loaves and the fishes,
Yes.
and then something good and bigger comes out of that. Yeah.
How does AMAP go? Because the people who make the media narrative, it's really important that they receive these other narratives. Are they willingly accepting that, or is it a bit of resistance?
Look, it's in the early stages, but they've had projects that have looked at some issues, like, for instance, youth suicide, and so how do you get maybe more, while confronting those difficult issues, how do you get more hopeful kind of narratives out there?
Yes.
And so they'll try and highlight good examples, like, for instance, the journalists and the papers that ran stories on that, and brought out some of the truth of that situation. So that's one of the things. So how do you youth suicide might be from one angle, just another kind of media bad news story. From another angle, where you give examples of hope, there are some good news stories
absolutely
out there, and so that's where some of the healing can come. So that's one example. Because in terms of youth, I remember Richard Eckersley talking. He was a youth specialist at that stage. At a conference we ran on ecological issues, and there's a lot of despair out there. There's a lot of despair about issues like climate change amongst young people, and how do we actually empower people to be able to tackle those issues? And I think there are lots of issues that we need to tackle amongst the different religions, actually combining on tackling those issues.
Yeah.
So while I think we can maintain our claims to religious exclusivism in terms of truth, and not kind of try to water down to some lowest common denominator. And Miroslav Volf, my doctoral mentor, was recently on Q&A. He was out here talking about that. But we can have a claim to religious exclusivity, like, for instance, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But you can have deep respect for other people's religious convictions and how they play out in public life, and that they need to have the space, even in a secular society, not a secularist society where it becomes almost its own religion, but a secular society where it's a genuinely pluralist society where people are able to publicly engage about those issues.
That's right.
But we don't have to be violent towards each other. We can be genuinely respectful. And we don't have to be just tolerant in the sense of putting up with, but we can actually be genuinely hospitable and welcoming and listening and dialoguing with each other. And tackling some of these big issues like climate change, for instance. Really, they've got to be tackled in a bipartisan way, and our politicians tackle them in that kind of way, or refugees, or Indigenous issues, for instance, if we're going to make sustained progress.
Yes.
But if you're just chopping and changing every 3 years, then we're not going to make any progress on those issues. And in the same token, I think the religious leaders need to, and there is dialogue between the religious leaders on these issues. You know, there is a religious coalition on climate change issues, for instance, and that there are groups getting together on the refugee issues. So I can remember after 9/11 being on ABC TV, I used to fill in for the Archbishop, and the various religious leaders were there. And I was asked straight after 9/11, it was on the ABC, will this issue kind of go away? And basically I wanted to say, well, no, it's not going to go away. It's a very, very big issue. But what I want to say is that the world didn't change forever in 9/11. Like, as a Christian, it was Christmas was coming up, and I want to say it changed forever at 25/12 or 12/25, to put it the American way. And then I looked along the line at the various other religious leaders who I have great respect for, and said, but you would want to say, the same in terms of your own religion. And we can debate that. We can even argue robustly about that, but with great respect for each other, without, taking rifles to each other or bombs to each other.
That's right.
And I think we need to be able to foster that spirit in our public life.
Yes. So do you come across parallels to ethos, like a Muslim ethos or a Buddhist ethos?
Oh, look, I'm sure they're out there in various ways. I haven't particularly discovered sort of formal ethics organisations, but I think there are parallels in terms of a lot of ethical issues. C.S. Lewis, many years ago, in the Abolition of Man, had in the appendix, he talked about the law of Tao. Which basically roughly corresponds to the sort of second half of the Ten Commandments. You basically can't have a society where adultery is rife, where people are stealing from each other, etc., etc. Every society needs something like that, and it's a kind of like a natural law. And so we can have basic agreement about those things on the basis of creation, but then there are particular expressions of that through our religious leaders.
Now, I'm going to steal something, or time has stole something. Thanks so much, Gordon. It would be wonderful to speak to you again at some later time, and
love to.
That would be wonderful. You've been watching Harmony in Diversity, and we'll be back next week.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om, Allahu